an Apex Lab podcast. Hey there, welcome to the Level Up Engineering Podcast, where we speak to the most experienced technology leaders from around the world. So stay with us to learn actionable management insights to take your engineering team to the next level. This show is powered by Apex Lab, a team of experts in end-to-end digital product development. ApexLab.io.
Dearest listeners and watchers, I am Carolina Toth, and this is the Level Up Engineering Podcast. I interview engineering leaders bi-weekly, and I'm really glad you're here with us today. I have another amazing guest who is going to join us for a conversation about culture. But before we get into that, please help me welcome Dave Yeager, the Director of Data Infrastructure at Recurve.
Glad to be here. This is exciting. It's a great podcast, so I'm pleased to be here.
We are so happy to have you here. And without further ado, please give us a little bit of insight as to what we should know about you if some of our listeners don't know you at all.
I've been in the software engineering industry for about 20 years or so. Background very much in large, very, very large organizations. I did some work at Lockheed Martin, then I did some work at Boeing, then I did some work at BlackRock for a number of years, about 12 years, when BlackRock was, you never want to call BlackRock small, but certainly when I was there, when I started there, it was small compared to its competitors. The Wilmington, Delaware office I worked in really just had a couple floors worth of people in it. And when I left, it had expanded to 800 people across 2 different buildings in that Wilmington office. BlackRock was a great place to work. And now for the last 7+ years, I've been working at an organization called Recurve, which is trying to solve the carbon emission, global warming problem by trying to align incentives. When I left BlackRock, I wanted to know, is there a way that I could get the portfolio managers that I've worked with here at this company to want to invest in things like energy efficiency? Mm-hmm. How would I get them to invest in that the same way they would invest in a bond or an equity or any kind of financial instrument? And this is the only thing I've seen so far that kind of makes some sense to me. And so it's been really interesting. I was one of the original 5 folks that was kind of at Recurve when we got the thing going. Recurve has grown to over 70 people now, and it's a lot of fun.
Congratulations! I'm happy to hear that. It's always nice when people share some good stories like that, and I'm hoping to hear more about that within our conversation today. So, as I hinted on that before, today our conversation is about culture and how to fix a ruined work culture. And I would like to say, let's start by defining what we should call a work culture for the purposes of our conversation, and how we should define it when it's broken or ruined.
I think that's a great place to start. When I look at culture in business or anywhere, even sports, is really interesting in the sense that successful organizations always point to their culture as an advantage, even if the culture is kind of objectively terrible, right? There's plenty of organizations that you can think of, especially in the tech industry, that you can point to over the last couple decades, where you can say, wow, that is a really successful organization in terms of their bottom line. Their shareholders are very happy. They're making massive profits, but boy, it's a terrible place to work, right? You can point at that very easily. It's always interesting to me with sports teams, right? I'm a big baseball fan. Every baseball team that wins the World Series or wins the championship always says, well, we've just got a great culture here. And, I've always been interested in that in the sense that, it seems like you can be successful even if your culture isn't great. So that being the case, what is the value, of culture? And the way I've looked at it is that if you look at kind of the history of organizations, the ones that have terrible culture can be successful, but over a much shorter time horizon. You can look at examples like, kind of throughout the last couple decades in particular, where you've got organizations that rose very, very quickly, became extremely successful, but then had big tapering offs because it was revealed that their culture was terrible. It became harder to attract talent and keep it. I always find it interesting to talk about it. And culture, to me, always has to evolve. You have to let new people, when they come into the company, bring their own spark to the equation. But that's, to me, is why, kind of the one aspect of culture I think is the most valuable that has to be preserved is that culture of vulnerability. And what I mean by that is the ability to make mistakes, especially in tech.
I love that place, and I am also a big advocate of being vulnerable in the workplace. And I find that it's probably especially hard when the majority of the workforce is usually men, especially in smaller companies. But I also find that it is sometimes easier to mold the culture when it is a smaller company. You have experience with large and smaller organizations. Which one do you think is easier to build a good culture in?
Boy, that's a great question. I've been thinking about this. It's a perfect question. I think that when you're first starting out, culture is easier to steer, right? Obviously, with a smaller organization, because you can have an actual global company culture. The larger you get, though, as an organization, you can have some ideals about your culture, but every team is going to start to emerge with its own culture in large organizations. We're already seeing that at Recurve, and I don't think that's a bad thing, right? I think the way that potentially the business development side and that team, kind of runs their day to day, it's okay for that to be different than the way the engineering, the technology team runs its day to day and thinks about their culture. But you want to have some unifying aspects that you can go and recognize anywhere you go in the organization. And so I think, to your point, the smaller the organization is, the easier it is to kind of have a more homogenous culture, something that carries a lot of the same aspects. That can be good and bad. But then the bigger you get, the more it starts to change. And that's where having just a couple of key cultural values can really help. And that's another reason why I like the vulnerability one. Whenever I'm talking to folks that may be thinking about joining the organization or interviewing or welcoming people on board when they join, I ask them, I hope you can bring something new to our culture and help our culture evolve. We never want to be stagnant. But the one thing I ask people is, can you help me preserve this one thing, this culture of vulnerability? Because I want Recurve to kind of always be a place where it's possible to make mistakes and not be punished. We learn from our mistakes more than we learn from our successes. And yes, of course, you make the same mistake 5 times in a row, we're going to have a conversation. But that first couple times a mistake happens, that's how you learn. And when you're in a smaller company trying to, a startup in particular, mistakes are going to happen, and you have to have systems on the technology side and processes in place to make sure that people are okay putting their hand in the air and saying, yeah, I really messed this thing up, but I want to talk about it, so that everybody can learn from that. So, yeah, to your question, certainly smaller, you can keep everything a little more, everybody can kind of approach things with a very similar culture. But as you get bigger, I think you have to let different business units and teams emerge with their own special cultures.
Mm-hmm.
And try to keep one thing uniform across the company. And if we can keep vulnerability uniform across Recurve, I'd be very happy.
Going through with that train of thought, we haven't spoken about what maybe a culture that isn't healthy would look like. And, without pointing fingers or naming names, could you give us maybe an example of what you would consider as maybe a toxic work culture or something that isn't healthy so that for the purposes of our conversation, we can be on the same page.
Sure, absolutely. I think that you've got there's the one metric people always point to like try to figure out like whether a culture is healthy or not is usually retention, right? Employee retention. So that's like kind of your first sign, your first most obvious sign. Hey, do I have a lot of turnover? Do I have a lot of people leaving? It's certainly been my experience that different things motivate different people, right? Especially early in their career, people are going to be attracted to the biggest salary they can get, things like that. But the fact of the matter is that your career, your work, is a huge part of your life. You spend 8 hours a day sleeping. You spend 8 hours a day, probably more sometimes in a startup, working. And that's a huge percentage of what you do. And so for some people, like, just the biggest salary is fine, and that motivates them. But like, especially as people get comfortable in their career, it starts to become much more about like, what am I doing? Am I really enjoying this? And the type of people that are, you can tell a culture is having trouble if you've got lots of people kind of leaving, lots of people looking. Quiet quitting in particular these days is a real sign of a toxic culture, because that means people aren't even willing to discuss the problem that like has them leaving. And so it used to be at least sometimes that you would find out in an exit interview kind of what's going on. But now, these days, I think, kind of with the phenomenon of the quiet quit, which maybe isn't even new, maybe it's just something we have a name for now. But with that phenomenon in particular, if you have people just leaving and, kind of having already checked out and looking for things, you've got a toxic culture. Certainly an example I can give, without naming names, I can look at, a department that I was working with at one point in my career, and I won't, like I said, name any names or point anything out, but it was the type of situation where folks always worked for themselves and weren't motivated in any way to kind of help each other. The incentives were not aligned to do that. There was no motivation in the way that the success was rewarded to help each other out. You were better off not helping somebody and trying to take the credit for yourself, the way the yearly review process worked in that department and the way the metrics were aligned. That's not going to work long term for the types of people that are going to help your company get better. It can help you short term in the bottom line and be very good for a year or two for your numbers, but it's not going to help your organization mature and be long lasting. And so that's one example.
Thank you. I think about a culture a lot as a freelance consultant, and I want to be of the idea that it's there is a perfect fit for like everyone, because there are those people who are more self-centered and want to achieve success through their own work, and maybe those people are the individual contributors. Maybe those people shouldn't be leading teams and such. But I also I like the idea of contributing together and building things together, because I think that's what we have organizations for and teams for, to strive for something more than what we only as individuals can bring to the table. And so when it comes to like culture, I think it's important for companies to define, as you said, who they are and point to some keywords that they associate themselves with, like for you guys at Recurve, it might be vulnerability and being able to stay vulnerable. What are some other things that you have used as behaviors to promote a healthy work culture?
Sure. So there's an interesting thing that we do, and a number of organizations do this, where kind of when we have our all hands meetings, and we're still small enough where having an all hands meeting once a month is something you can do, without as much trouble as you might be able to have. If you were 1,000 or 10,000 person organization, all hands meetings are tough, type of thing you do once a year. But, Recurve are still in the, kind of an employee count of in the 70s. So we still have these all hands meetings, kind of every every month. And one of my favorite parts of the all hands is the cheers, cheers and jeers. And, cheers and jeers is an opportunity to call out, and give some thanks to somebody who helped you out with something. You're not going to get into the cheers section if you're not helping your coworkers in some way. Jeers are lighthearted. They're not meant to be, kind of mean or anything like that. And they can, kind of poke fun a little bit at yourself for a mistake you made, and say, hey, I want everybody to help learn from this. If you have the ability to one of the things that helps do is when your leadership and your management is contributing to that, it demonstrates to others that hey, it's okay you can also contribute to this. This is we're setting you hope to set an example where talking about that stuff is okay. So that's one thing. Another thing about culture in general is that as a company gets bigger, to your smaller and bigger company question, so much of the experience of the culture becomes about the direct manager. So much of it, right? There might be, in a very large organization, the culture might generally be okay, but there might be a couple of departments that are really quite bad, very toxic, right? And the reason comes down to, kind of management style. Your experience of a company is so hugely tied to your manager. And this is part of why I emphasize that culture of vulnerability so much, especially with folks, if I can, that are coming in to be managers. Management is a bit, to me, of a sacred duty. People are coming to you and coming onto your organization, especially in a startup, and they're taking a risk with their careers. They're handing over, like I said, a huge portion of their life to the idea of what the company is trying to accomplish, as much as they hand over, just getting their sleep every night. In the evening, you sleep and you dream. Hopefully you dream when you come to work too. It's a huge aspect of what you do. And so a manager has a sacred duty, I think, to really help guide the career and be an advocate for people on their team. That only works if the alignment of incentives is right for, kind of the manager to act that way, to be that type of person, to have that type of culture that says, yes, let's try this thing, even though I don't know it's going to work out. It's okay if it doesn't. It won't impact your career here. We're going to try it. It's an interesting idea. Let's see if it works. If it doesn't work, it's okay, though. That's the only way I know of to kind of do the job. There's other ways to manage, certainly seen them. And they can work. But the only way I know how to do it is kind of just to, you want to bring empathy to the table every day and remember that people are trying to forge something for themselves in their career. They're trying to make their own story. And work is a huge part of that.
For sure.
And if they don't like the story they're forming, they're going to go somewhere else. So that's a huge part of it.
For sure. And I love how you put that in quite poetic words that people are handing over a portion of their lives. So if some of our listeners are thinking about, switching to a different company, what would you advise to them when looking for a company with a good, healthy culture? What are some ways that they can spot, red flags or maybe signs of a bad work culture before they have joined the company?
Oh, what a great question. Gosh, when I interview, I ask whoever I'm interviewing with to kind of describe the work environment in one word. If you let people describe it in more than that, that can be helpful. It's not like it's bad information, but at the same time, if you're forced to limit your description to one word, you're going to pick that word very carefully, and it's going to be the most obvious, most prominent thing, right? You've probably noticed I've mentioned vulnerability several times. That's kind of the one word for me at Recurve. Mm-hmm. If that ever were to disappear, if that part of the culture were ever to disappear, it would make me want to start looking elsewhere, right? That's one of the aspects I really enjoy about the culture. So often when I'm interviewing, I try to, kind of ask, can you describe it? Can you tell me what the work environment is like in just one word, one word only? If folks have a hard time doing that, that's also a signal, mm-hmm. right? Because if they're limited to one word, they're really kind of thinking, oh gosh, what word should I pick that isn't going to, kind of sound terrible? That's one aspect of it. So that can kind of be a tell. So that's certainly one of the things I've done in the past is kind of ask about that. And, the other thing I ask about is, kind of what does the yearly review process look like? Now, this one's tougher for when you're new and you're kind of you're getting started in your career. But you can learn a lot by, okay, does this company have a bonus structure? Does it have, kind of what kind of objectives and key results, kind of thing are they following? It tells you a lot about kind of how the company works. Bonus structures are fine. I never have a problem with them. But like if they do have a bonus structure, okay, how do the bonuses get awarded? Is it you go in front of a panel or your manager makes arguments for you, or is there an objective list of things that you can tick to like get that bonus? If it's not objective lists of things, that's tricky for me because then it's a question of, okay, well now there's this extra bit of power that one or two individuals have to incentivize behaviors that, kind of they like. And so those are things I look for, but it's also easier for me to say that. Obviously, when you're trying to get into the job market and get started, you kind of take whatever you take what you can get and you try to establish yourself and get going. But those are certainly things I ask at this point in my career.
I think it's important to also reward, like, personally, people who are loyal and people who are
absolutely
with the company and consciously work for the culture of that company. So, like, I don't think that it's really good if someone's bonus is only based on the objective results.
Yeah.
And maybe if there is a way to reward people for how much other people like working with them, I think that's like a sign of a healthy culture. Of course, there should be balance in getting things done and being liked, but I don't think it's healthy when people are only awarded based on the results that they get, even when it comes at the cost of, like their relationships within the team.
I think you're making a really good point there, because one of the things that like always bugs me about bonus structures, I'm not against bonus structures, but like one of the things that sometimes bugs me about it is the way you put together a bonus structure is really tricky to get right to me. To your point, what if you have somebody who's a tremendous contributor to other people's projects, that's always willing to help, that's always willing to jump in, but they might not be the key person on that project. It's not as likely for them to get the credit for the 10 other things they helped 10 different people on, and they delivered one thing themselves, right? Okay, well, how do you bonus that person? How do you make sure that behavior where they're willing to help and jump in and assist on things based on what they see as most important, based on what they see as like where they can make the biggest contribution? How do you measure that? This is what I mean by tricky. And to your point, that's one of the areas where an objective thing can really trip you up. If it's, kind of a question of what was the key projects that you were the primary responsible person on, that person might only have one, but might have contributed to the success of 10 others. So I think you're making a really good point there. It's really tricky, and you got to be careful when you have bonus and reward structures, how they're structured. And I do agree with you. I do think there needs to be some leeway. But if it can't be all the other way either. If it's just a one manager or one person or a panel or something like that that's awarding the bonuses based on argument and subjective discussion over who the best contributor is, immediately bias enters the equation, right? And so it's very, very tricky. It's very, very tricky. That could be a whole other discussion. There's like bonus structures and things like that. I've never been able to figure out what the best bonus structure should look like, because they all have a little bit of trickiness to them. If you have good people, that's the silver bullet. But, how do you know you have good people, right? Very, very tricky. So
Right. I completely agree with you. And going forward with your vulnerability as a key concept when it comes to your culture. For me, what I usually point to as what I think is my like key culture fit skill is like a growth mindset. And I think it's kind of a similar concept to vulnerability, because a growth mindset says, like even if you made a mistake, you can learn from it rather than define yourself as that mistake or as that person who never makes mistakes. And within that concept, I think it's really important for any company to say, these are the things that we define as important, and we are gonna base our reward systems around those concepts. So if it's, like a growth mindset, it could be, how many projects have you tried to get into this year or whatever? What are some of the things that you have tried and failed, and what have you learned based on those tryings? And so I think those are some things that we can give to people who are listening to us, to help them decide whether or not the company that they are trying to get into is similar to what they are expecting. Moving on to when you're in a company, what are some signs? Because culture is always, I think, as you said, evolving. What are some things that people can watch out for as individual contributors or as team leaders or as parts of management? What should they be watching out for to keep the healthy company culture that they have?
There's two main things for me. The first one is when you start to see culture used as a weapon. What I mean by that is the classic, we don't do things that way around here, right? Like, kind of thing, that kind of mentality. As soon as you start hearing that, you've kind of like gotten off track. You should always be willing to try things, even potentially things you've tried before, previously, that didn't work. If time has passed, I often say, this is something I say sometimes, is that, experience can be a trap. If something I did 7-8 years ago, I tried something and it didn't work, that doesn't mean in different circumstances, in a different time, it won't work now. So once you start hearing things like, we don't do things that way around here, that's kind of a good sign. A very tangible thing, if you're somebody, kind of in a company, kind of on an individual contributor basis or things like that. If you're not having conversations with your manager regularly, that's a bad sign. Okay, like that your culture's in trouble, and the reason for that is that a manager's job is to make sure. I look at a manager's job as this, right? We talked about kind of helping people guide people's dreams, but you can tell a manager's doing a good job if every single person on the team knows whether they're doing a good job or not. If they don't know they're doing a good job and they're not sure, and it's going to be a surprise next time they have to talk conversation with the manager, hey, how am I doing? Manager's not doing their job then. There needs to be constant conversation. And this is hard, right? Managers, like anybody else, have a lot of full calendars, right? Especially in startups and, kind of very busy organizations. You got a full calendar as a manager, but you have to spend time every week, every 2 weeks at worst, talking to every single person, on your team and making sure they know. I prefer every week. But that can be very challenging with bigger and bigger teams. And, you have to have that conversation with people and let them know, hey, what's going well? What isn't going well? Every single person in an organization should be able to answer the question, am I doing a good job? Am I on track for success? Am I on track for that promotion? They should be able to answer that question. It should never be a mystery. And there's a lot of organizations where people just have no idea. I talk to people all the time, just going out to have a chat, have a drink or whatever. They have no clue whether they're doing a good job or not. They're like, I guess I'm going to find out, at the end of the quarter. Mm-hmm. That's not good. that's not good. So that's, again, that allows kind of bad culture, toxic culture to creep in, because somebody can say to you, well, you didn't do X, Y, Z. Well, you never told me that. Well, that's how you're getting measured. Well, how's that fair?
Right.
If I had known that, I would have done things differently.
Right. I completely agree with you. And I think feedback is such an often disregarded aspect of our lives, and not just in companies, but also in our private lives. I think it takes courage to give like honest and valuable feedback, but people are often maybe afraid for the relationship that they have with that person or the rapport that they have built. And I think it's important to point out that if you work a lot with someone, then there is gonna be friction no matter what, because being around a person just gives ample opportunity for friction. But if people just like build up their mismatch of expectations, or if they build up their hurtful experiences, then it's just gonna get worse, and the other people probably won't know that they have done something wrong, and if they don't talk about that, then there's probably not gonna be enough room for improvement. So to your point, I think feedback is one of the most important parts of communications when it comes to an organization. And that's probably the leader's job to give a good example as to how feedback should be given. And so, based on that, do you think one manager or one bad apple is enough for a company culture to take a different route, or is it not enough?
I don't think one bad manager in a large company can ruin the whole company culture, but without question, it can ruin the culture of a whole section of the organization. Everybody coming out of that group that is successful is going to carry the same bad cultural outlook, right? So the worst part about it, the thing that makes a bad manager so challenging, right, is that they're going to reward potentially behaviors that you don't want rewarded. And that's just going to exacerbate the problem. They're going to put people in positions where they behave like they do. This is hard, right? This is really hard. I always ask myself, am I doing an okay job? And how do you know, right? To your point on the feedback, if I'm talking to a friend or my wife or something like that, and they're giving me, criticism or feedback or, kind of having some instruction, I trust them. Because over time I've built up that level of trust. But if I've got, a new employee on my team, they don't trust me on day one. It would be crazy to trust me on day one. They don't know me. It's going to take a lot of time to get that trust, if you ever get it. And so what feedback am I really going to get from them that tells me I need to steer things if they don't trust me or they're worried about their career or keeping their job? Getting feedback as a manager is really hard for me. And because how do you know you're getting the right feedback, kind of from the people reporting you? There's an imbalance of power there that, kind of suggests that, well, maybe they want to give me good feedback because they're afraid I won't like them anymore, or I won't, I won't help them in their career. So it can take a lot of time. And so if you've got a bad manager that's, kind of doing that and then promoting people that have seen those behaviors rewarded, it can definitely get worse. A good manager at a good company, kind of just, it really helps people to advance their career, obviously, but it's hard to know. I think measuring whether or not somebody's a good manager or not, I think is very challenging. You can only do it by looking at how is everybody on this team performing, right? How is everybody on this team performing? Not necessarily what is the manager doing, but is everybody on this team, do they have good retention there? Do they help each other? Are the business outcomes good? And to your point, the growth. What things have they tried and didn't work that now we can learn from as a whole organization? So, yeah, it's hard. So I don't think one bad manager can ruin it. Not right away, but I think over time, potentially they can. Especially in a smaller organization.
And if we turn that question around, do you think if someone went to a company and maybe they haven't researched the company culture well enough, but perhaps they like the product or they really enjoy the kind of work that they do and they want to turn around the culture, is one good apple enough? And that's not an expression, but like, you're welcome, everyone. So is one good apple enough to like turn the entire apple forest into good apples? Or how do you think one person should go about changing certain aspects of a culture?
Well, I think that certainly as a company gets bigger, the best you can do as a manager in a really, really large company is, to your point, kind of mind your own barrel of apples.
Mm-hmm.
They have the barrel of apples can be shrunk in size to your team. Try to make sure there aren't any bad apples in there. That's the best you can kind of do in a big organization. In a smaller organization, you can have a little more influence. You can have conversations and say, "Hey," to another manager, "What's going on? Let's talk about what's happening." Kind of with your team. You've got a lot of turnover. Maybe there's some lessons we can talk to about each other. But ultimately, one good manager, I think one bad manager has a lot more influence than one bad manager or than one good manager, to your point. I think it's really hard. A good manager can make sure that their team is taken care of, whereas a bad manager can have impact that can kind of spread across. And so how do you identify bad managers? Yeah, that's something that definitely has always been on my mind. Tricky. How do I know I'm not one? Right. To our previous point. How do I ever know I'm not a bad manager? It's hard to know. These things are tricky because of the way, like you said, getting feedback from managers is hard, right? You can get the feedback from your peers, but your peers as managers aren't necessarily dealing with the day-to-day interactions that, kind of individual contributors are dealing with. And so you can only look at, hey, are the outcomes good here? Are people staying, right? Are people staying here at this organization? To your point you made earlier, hey, people will stay because hey, maybe they like the work. They might hate the manager, but maybe they like the work. Maybe the work is interesting enough that it outweighs it. Maybe the pay is good enough that it outweighs it. Vice versa. Maybe they could make more money elsewhere, but they like working with this person in this group. So it's really hard. There's a lot of variables and it takes a ton of work to really know. But again, you asked a really good question earlier. How do you identify? You keep your eye peeled for those two main things, right? We don't do things that way around here, as one of them. And do I get to meet with my manager regularly? Does everybody know they're doing a good job or not? You keep your eye out for those two things, and you're probably on the right track. And then there's other things to look at.
Right. And you made me think of one thing as a manager. If you get feedback that maybe questions how you have viewed yourself up to that point, I think it's really good to go ahead and maybe feel for that feedback in other areas of your team or in other areas of the organization. And even if it turns out that only one person was, in a bad state of their life, and that's why they gave you feedback that wasn't so great on you, I think it's important to always show that you appreciate the feedback, no matter the kind, so people won't be afraid for their position or for their bonus, as we talked about, or for whatever reason, to give you the honest feedback that they think would help you grow as a manager. What are some other practical steps that you think managers can take to make sure that they create a thriving work environment and a healthy culture?
Yeah, if we're talking, this is an engineering podcast. We can talk about some tech stuff. On the one hand, obviously, when you're talking about creating an area where it's people are allowed to make mistakes and things like that, there's a reason engineering has grown up with three-stage deployment, dev, test, prod, that type of stuff, continuous integration. But I want to point out one thing about kind of continuous integration that I think is interesting, is that continuous integration is one of those things that only works if the tests are good. I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know here, but it is fascinating to me when an organization gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the tests become an obstacle, right? And so then they're no longer serving the purpose of this is going to help prevent mistakes or it's going to teach me about mistakes. How many times can people tell stories about, kind of an engineer trying to get a release through, some tests they don't understand failing, and then they go in as part of the release and just change that test, right? How often have people heard those stories? That's a good example of okay, well, the problem here, we haven't solved the problem of making mistakes and being vulnerable with technology. We've got the technology, but the process isn't good, right? There should be a capability if that test is failing. Who is the person? Who's the group I can go to? I don't understand this test. I don't understand what it does. I don't understand why it's failing. I don't understand why I should care. Can somebody explain it to me? That should be a question that's okay. Not the release needs to go out on Friday, so the tests need to pass. That's a great kind of example of where the culture is warped one way or the other. If the goal is to push the thing out the door by Friday, the tests aren't going to be updated in any way that's meaningful, and nobody's going to learn anything. They're just going to get rid of the test or they're going to change the way the test works. If the culture is good, they have an opportunity. Okay, this thing's going to slip a week, or it's going to slip to Monday, or it's going to slip to Tuesday, but we're all going to learn why this test exists and what's going on here. That's a good example, all right, of something that's like a really practical process approach. How often do people, institute, okay, you got to, in order to merge this code, there has to be a pull request. And, one or two people who are senior developers have to approve it. Okay, great. How many senior developers, and it's okay, to be honest, we can all be vulnerable here. How many senior developers go in and read every line of that code? They're busy. They look and see, hey, did the test pass? Okay, great, approve, and I'm moving on with my day. All right. If that's the way your pull request process works, nobody's learning anything. Like the way a pull request process should work is somebody who, the developer who did that, who's getting the approval for that person, that should be an opportunity for them to talk about how they did the thing. Not, here's the pull request, go look at it, press approve or not. I don't love that. Like, it should be an opportunity for people to come in and say, hey, I'm going to block, 15, 20 minutes of your time, and I'm going to walk you through this, right? That's how a pull request should work. So those are practical things that can be done. And, they're not new ideas, nothing revolutionary here, but it's so easy to slip into the habit of the process is, I need to approve this thing. But the process doesn't do any good if nobody's learning anything from it.
Thank you so much. And I can already hear former business decision makers speak to me saying, how is that good for the business? We don't have time for this. We need to deploy. We need to do the release. What would you say to those people, or what's your kind of general comeback?
I would say to those folks, look, I'm not going to tell anybody how to run their business. They're going to have a better idea than me. That's why they're in that business. But you have to ask yourself, what happens next time? It's a question of, am I going to meet this deadline and make this target, or am I going to make the next 7 targets? Because the way it's really just a little bit, it requires a little bit of forward thinking. And I understand the pressures of the day to day. Don't get me wrong. Like, hey, I work in a Series B organization, right? The pressures are real all the time, right? Oh my gosh, we got to meet this number. Oh my gosh, we got to get this release out. Okay, no problem. I get all that. But at the same time, if you want to get better and you want your business to last past that deadline in a meaningful way, sometimes you need to think about what it is you're actually accomplishing, right? Start with as my own boss likes to say, start with the why, right? Why are we doing this? To meet a deadline is a bad answer. if the deadline has a very compelling why behind it, we get $1 million bonus if we deliver this at this time. Hey, okay, now we're having a conversation, and maybe we'll debrief after. But if it's just because that's the deadline, that's a terrible reason. It doesn't make any. So you just got to think about what's going on. Yeah, I'm not going to tell anybody how to run their business, but if you're pushing a deadline for the sake of a deadline, it's pretty obvious something's not right.
Thank you so much for saying that. And I also feel the need to say that deadlines are usually, just arbitrarily made by people so that we have them. But if it's not the moon landing or something like that, then the deadline can probably be pushed out a few days, making sure that
exactly, yeah, and
that
I'm not
the tests pass.
Yeah, I totally agree.
So when it comes to you, I think you have a very atypical career path, because what I have found is that usually when people are young, they will go to the startups and they will pour their soul into their work, and then as they grow older, they want like more stable jobs with bigger companies with security and health insurance, and like perhaps like premium class on airfares and whatnot.
Right.
But
right.
But you seem to have walked the opposite way, and I'm just curious about your philosophies when it comes to building the organizational culture within your company now. You have pointed us in directions, but what is your why, and how can you tie that into your day in and day out?
Well, I'll say this: my why definitely comes down to one of the things that really makes me excited in my career is, the potential to someday report to somebody who I once worked with. I really get excited about that. There's a number of people I've worked with in my career that I would be thrilled to report to, right? Over the last 20 years. There's people that are working with me right now, that I would be thrilled to report to them someday. That's kind of my dream. If that can happen, then it means that, okay, maybe that's a sign that all this stuff we're talking about, that maybe I was a good manager. Still enjoy the technical aspect of things. Don't get me wrong. I still like getting my hands dirty and, writing code on a daily basis. But the managing stuff is interesting, and you can accomplish so much, with a team that you can't accomplish alone. The stuff that motivates me in terms of, I'm very privileged in my career to, I live in Wilmington, Delaware. It's a great little place, but it isn't that expensive, kind of compared to other places to live. That's one of the benefits of remote work, certainly. I've got a lovely wife who's very successful. And so I have a lot of privilege behind me for sure that allows me to take those types of chances. I don't have financial obligations to children or kids or anything like that, trying to put them through school or support them. So it's easier. Make no mistake, I have a lot of privilege behind me that allows me to kind of take those types of chances rather than working for. And that's what motivates me. I think it's really interesting. I love seeing. There's nothing I like better in my career than like working with entry-level developers. Gosh, I love that. Especially people who have gone through like code academies and things like that are looking to change their lives. Right? Code academies sometimes get this reputation of these boot camps. Oh, they're giving them the bare minimum and like they're not that useful. We can put them into, gosh, I think of it totally the opposite way. Somebody who's willing to go through that type of thing really wants to change their lives and change their career. You can test people, in an entry-level way to see if they've got the ability to do the job, right? You can always figure out, can this person do the job? Do they have the technical skills? And then it becomes a question of, are they going to be able to do it over time? But man, I love working with entry-level developers. They bring such interesting ideas and such enthusiasm, especially people who are going through career changes. They approach the problem as an opportunity to change their lives and change the type of work they're doing. And they just take it so seriously and so passionately. And it keeps me motivated. It makes me continue to be excited. Even at 45, all this time later, what an industry, right? That's one of the wonderful things about tech. All industries change over time, but boy, does tech change fast. And the thing you were working on 10 years ago probably is obsolete by now.
Oh, for
it's
sure.
Just so interesting.
For sure. I also, in what you said about people who are changing their professions to developing, I think it is very much of a challenge to maybe have an established career and be willing to say, okay, I'm going to be a junior in software development because I want to get into that type of work or because I want to make that kind of money or whatever. And it just really made me think about what you said. As a manager, people are putting their lives into your hands in some way, and they look to you for helping them accomplish their dreams. And you are, if you are a manager, you are sort of in position to actually help people change their lives. What would you say to our listeners who are managers and want to create a really healthy work culture within their team, and maybe who want to be, because you already mentioned some things about being open to feedback, but people who would want to create a strong, healthy culture within the team?
There are some things I do that are just personal habits that I learned from a wonderful boss I had, previously in my career, somebody I still keep in touch with, who I just still, like I said, I've been very privileged, been very fortunate in my career to run across such opportunities to work with people who are really who have approached their job with vulnerability and learn that as a habit for success. I think that some of the things I do is I tell everybody all the time, if there's any time on my calendar, take it. You don't need to ask me, just take it. My calendar, I block off the time I need to write code or do software development in chunks, a day or two in advance. If any time is ever available, you do not need to ask me. Just go in, block the time off the calendar, and it's yours, right, in the working hours. That's one thing I do. And that's great because, especially in a remote company, it's not easy for people to just walk by the office door and knock and see, like, hey, is it okay if we have a quick chat? That's hard. So having some way to kind of mimic that, hey, my door's open, you can see the calendar's open, go ahead and put an hour block on it, put 2 hours on if 2 hours open. Like, that's what the time is there for, grab it, all right? If the day before that time's open, I might block it for focused time to be able to write some code, but any open time, grab it. The other thing, as I said before, is that you need to have, even if it's hard, even if you've got a huge team, you need to be having those one-on-one conversations, even if there's no kind of agenda driving it right away. You need to be able to say, okay, like every week we're sitting down for 45 minutes, half hour, 45 minutes, the longer the better. And that person comes in and you can start with, hey, anything you want to talk about. And most times they're going to say no, right? It's like, the old thing when the kids come from, hey, how was school today? Anything happened? Nothing. Well, a million things probably happened, right? It's just the same thing with, somebody who's coming in and sitting down and, how's work going? What's anything you want to talk about? No, I'm good. Well, have some probing questions. What have you been working on this week? How's this project going? What's going on here? Start to drive the conversation. That's part of your job as manager. Don't wait for the person to bring the problem to you. Try to suss out if there is a problem that they're not talking about. That's part of your job. So those are the habits I learned from wonderful managers I had.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for being so pragmatic about them. One thing that came to my mind from earlier in our conversation, that maybe we could call it mistake tolerance when it comes to teams and making it okay to make mistakes, and actually like own up to your mistakes because it doesn't, come out of your salary or anything like that. Is there a way that you can share with us to build mistake tolerance into development or into the work that we do in IT?
Yeah, I think so. I'll take some examples. I think that there's process we can use and technology we can use to help. But let me give some examples of like mistakes I made. One example I always tell like new people to try and just kind of hammer home. It's okay to put your hand in the air and be like, "Wow, did I screw that up?" I've made mistakes in my career that are just colossal. Like I did one time at BlackRock, I crashed the entire email server on like my third week at the company. Brought the entire thing down. I made a $30,000 mistake on Google Cloud when I was trying something out. Fortunately, was able to get a refund on it. But like when I saw that charge appear, I was like, "Oh my gosh, that was totally me. I screwed that up," and immediately said, "This is me. I messed this up. This is what happened," so that we can try to avoid it happening again. You just got to be vocal about that stuff. In terms of like process and tolerance, I think it's really just about like making sure that like the development environments that you put people in have those safety nets. Right. Again, there's a reason we have 3-tier structures. There's a reason we have a dev environment, a test environment, a prod environment in most organizations. Nothing new there. But you got to make sure that like they actually work and are functional. One of the things that happens with a dev environment versus a prod environment is they tend to drift farther and farther and farther apart. It takes real hard work and dedicated people to keep that dev environment actually like reflecting reality. Right. So certainly one of the things I saw at BlackRock that I thought was really effective was like regular refreshes, of the entire database, things like that had no regard, kind of for like what project was being worked on. That type of forcible approach does a couple things. One, it says, okay, this isn't even ready for dev yet. This is still something I'm working on in my own private environment, and I'll publish it to dev when I'm in a more stable state. So there's practical things you can do, but I think that the main thing is just tone setting. All right. Every time I make a mistake, I make sure to, kind of mention it. I do a lot of pairing, kind of with new programmers so they can see the mistakes I'm making line by line as I go, that I'm fixing as I go. So they can see that like, hey, this is a job that requires you to mess up. The wonderful thing about programming is versus other types of engineering, software engineering versus other types of engineering. If I build a bridge and I get the bridge wrong, when the bridge collapses, it's like a really big deal. But when I'm first trying to experiment and build something in software, Frederick Brooks, had that wonderful thing. The software, the programmer builds castles in the sky, like the poet. That's very true because you can really quickly iterate. You don't need to get everything. Like you made the analogy earlier about putting somebody on the moon. Very different task, right, than trying to build a piece of software. You're allowed to make mistakes. The nature of software development encourages mistakes. Go ahead and try it, see if it runs. And if it doesn't, we try again. Iteration is just so fast in software versus a lot of other disciplines. It's one of the things I really like about it. And you're not going to learn to iterate if you're trying to make the perfect thing out of the gate. It's better to make a really crummy thing and then start to iterate on it and make it better, I think. There might be people who disagree with that, depending on what you're building. But I'm always a fan of like making something, getting it out there, and then iterating the heck out of it, versus the alternative of making it perfect on day one.
Thank you. I completely agree with you. And also, if you don't put things out there, then you can't get feedback by definition on it. And so you're not going to be able to, have many eyes and spot the mistakes that you might not have spotted before. I think we're approaching the end of our time, and we have talked about a plethora of things when it comes to work culture. A few things that stood out to me are the following. I think you mentioned that it's very important to build relationships, to have your regular one-on-ones, to carve out the time to make sure that we know the people that we are working with, and so we have the rapport to actually give feedback and not just be nice. And I also really loved how you put vulnerability out there, which I only think is possible when you have a culture that is based on trust and integrity of the people that you work with. And when it comes to integrity, I also thought that your point about raising your hand when you make mistakes is very important, and showing that as an example in a company is quite beneficial because other people will see your example and they will also be able to raise their hand and not try to make sure that people don't know when they made a mistake, and that's especially hurtful when it comes out later and people trace back the mistake and why didn't you say something. So also I thought your point about rules and how software development has processes for a reason, and making sure your tests don't fail for the sake of deploying on time is something that I will for sure use from now on, because those rules are there for a reason, but it's also okay to take risks when you see that those risks are for the betterment of the product or for the project or for the team. And it's not always so black and white, but I think our conversation has shed some light on what are the differences between those situations. Is there anything else that you would like to add to our conversation, or something that I have missed but you think is important?
I think that, well, first of all, I just wanted to say thank you for really good questions. You made me think of a lot of things, as I was saying them with those questions, and I thought that was great. And the other thing, we talked about it earlier. We learn from our mistakes, but we also learn from our successes. And I think sometimes, to the point of vulnerability, we can learn the wrong things from our successes, right? If short-term successes can be intoxicating. Long-term success takes a lot of discipline and is harder. And it goes to your point about the deadline, right? That's a short-term success potentially. Okay, we delivered on Friday on time. But what did we learn? How did we improve ourselves as an organization? We actually made ourselves worse in the example that we talked about, right? Where we just kind of blew through this test, changed the way the test works so it just passed on the continuous integration system and moved on with our lives so we delivered on time. That success, that perceived success, actually made us worse. And so it's possible to learn the wrong lessons from success if you're not looking at it over a longer time horizon. So that's the thing I'd say. The other reason I say vulnerability all the time is because vulnerability is scary. Good feedback can be scary. Receiving good feedback can be scary. Giving important feedback can be scary. You don't sometimes want to hurt people's feelings or things like that, but sometimes you have to be vulnerable enough to tell people this thing needs to change or this thing needs to improve. It's easy to tell people when they're doing a good job. It's harder to tell people when they need to change things about what they're doing. And so but you have to come at it with a view of empathy and vulnerability that yeah, this is a scary thing to say. This is probably a scary thing to hear, but I think you can get, we can get there. And that's why you have to have those conversations frequently. Having a conversation once a quarter with a report and telling them they're doing everything wrong, that's not helpful. It's not enough time. It's not enough opportunity for them to pivot. It's not enough opportunity for them to learn from you. And isn't that what you want?
Before we wrap up, please tell me, where can our listeners follow you or your work or the company?
The only social media I really engage in any kind of way is LinkedIn. I know that's such a corporate thing to say, but I don't get too involved in the other social media platforms. I do look at my LinkedIn because it's an interesting opportunity to meet new people, especially people on, kind of in the early stage of their careers in particular. So feel free to feel free to send me a connect on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to talk to people. As far as the company I'm at right now, check out recurve.com. If you want to contribute to some of the, kind of weights and measures we use to measure energy efficiency, all that's open source. We've got a very thriving open source community around the measurement aspect of what we do, check out caltrack.org or check out Linux Foundation Energy. And you can see us there, the OpenEE meter. If you're interested in how the calculations themselves work, it's all there. So
Wow.
that's it. And I hope it would be really cool to see some people join and, kind of contribute there. It's always fun to meet new people through that avenue.
Oh, for sure. Thank you so much for sharing what you thought about company culture and the healthy company culture. I really enjoyed our conversation today. And to our listeners and watchers, today my guest was David Yeager, the Director of Data Infrastructure at Recurve. And we talked about how company cultures can really benefit the business and how we can all make sure to be a really healthy part of company culture. I thank you for your attention today. I am Carolina Toth, and this is Level Up Engineering, and I hope to see you next time.
Thanks for staying with us. This was the Level Up Engineering Podcast by Apex Lab. Check them out at apexlab.io. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel, rate our content, and share your thoughts on this episode. See you next time.